this is the thing. If you can make federal laws to protect the bird, which is the bald eagle, you can make federal laws to protect people of color.
The family of George Floyd urges U.S. lawmakers to pass police reform legislation in memory of their loved one killed at the hands of a Minnesota police officer. Hi everyone, I'm Sean Calebs filling in for Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Welcome everyone. It has been 1 year since George Floyd called out repeatedly, "I can't breathe," prompting one of the largest social justice movements in U.S. history. Floyd, an unarmed black man, was killed in police custody when former Officer Derek Chauvin pressed his knee on his neck for more than 9 minutes. A jury found Chauvin guilty of second and third degree murder and second-degree manslaughter. In April, he will be sentenced to next month, and he faces up to 40 years in prison. Floyd's murder ignited nationwide protests, along with calls for racial justice and police reform. But 1 year later, U.S. lawmakers have failed to pass any meaningful federal legislation.
Their blood is on this legislation, so we're going to continue with this family and this legal team to continue to press to say, yeah, we have to respect the spilled blood that's on this legislation. It must be meaningful, and we can do this together. This is an American issue. This isn't a police issue or a civil rights issue. We have to look at this as a national issue.
Okay, now for more on George Floyd's legacy and efforts on police reform, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Los Angeles is Cheryl Dorsey. She is a retired Los Angeles Police Department sergeant and author of Black and Blue, The Creation of a Social Advocate. And from Maryland, Jason Nichols. He is a senior lecturer of African American Studies at the University of Maryland. From Washington, D.C., Imani Cheers, the associate director in the School of Media and Public Affairs at the George Washington University. And Joseph Williams. He is the senior news editor with U.S. News and World Report right here in Washington, D.C. Joseph, good to see you again. I want to start with you. Now, the family of George Floyd came to Washington, D.C. They met with President Joe Biden and members of the administration this week and pushed for the passing of some kind of meaningful legislation. The police reform bill that is being debated, that is being considered, would end certain police techniques, including chokeholds. Firstly, I want to get your thoughts on how we got to this point. And secondly, where do efforts stand on getting this measure through?
Well, certainly we got to this point through the events of last year, where there was a big upheaval in May, right around this time last year, when George Floyd was killed in plain view. People were, there was a teenager who videotaped it, and it went viral all around the world, in fact, because the act of police brutality that killed this man was so egregious and so obvious. People just couldn't ignore it. And not to mention the fact that most people were locked in a pandemic. We were on lockdown. You had to watch television. It was difficult to not see. It was difficult to ignore, and it was difficult to not understand exactly what people have been complaining about all these years about police brutality, and the fact that law enforcement in black communities tends to be different, a lot harsher, and a lot more than it does anywhere else. Black people are assumed to be criminals until they're proven otherwise, and even crimes as non-violent as trying to allegedly pass some bad money at a convenience store will get you killed. And certainly, as far as legislation goes, there was a lot of momentum after George Floyd died, and the momentum seemed to be picking up when Joe Biden replaced Donald Trump in the White House. It seemed like there was going to be a swift passage of this bill, a swift police reform package that everybody could get behind. But as politics ground on and as reality settled back in, it became a back burner issue to some other priorities that President Biden had, not to mention the fact that we have a filibuster that's still in play and a Republican Party that's just intransigent on this issue.
Interesting. And I would like all the members of our panel to listen to this next statement. It's Senator Cory Booker. He addressed qualified immunity. That's the legal doctrine that currently shields police officers from civil lawsuits. And here's what Booker had to say on CNN's State of the Union.
We need to, at some point, get qualified immunity. It's what I'm determined at this negotiating table to get. And these are labels that a lot of folks don't know what they mean. This means that in the United States of America, any profession that where you violate in a serious way the civil rights of another American, should someone be shielded. This is not about going after good officers. This is about when officers have breached the civil rights of another American citizen.
Cheryl, I'd like to get your thoughts on this. You're a 20-year veteran of the Los Angeles Police Department, and if I'm not mistaken, you were there when Daryl Gates was the head of the police department. Your thoughts on what Booker had to say and on this measure that people can use, that law enforcement can use to not be sued?
I'm bothered by the words "at some point." He wants to put an end to qualified immunity at some point. Why not right now, Cory Booker? How about that? Why don't we end qualified immunity today? Because absent that, they've done very little to honor the memory of George Floyd. And listen, it's not like these politicians who crafted this document don't realize that it's basically useless. I'm not sure if the Floyd family is being properly counseled with regards to what's in this police reform, because there's talk about ending qualified immunity, but factually it will limit qualified immunity, and I don't even know what that means. And the GOP has said that it's a non-starter even with the limitation. So if officers aren't planning on killing folks, what is it that they're so afraid of? And then there's talk about the no-knock search warrants on drug raids that are going to be prohibited, and that's not true either. They're going to prohibit federal no-knock warrants when there's a drug raid. But most of what we see, certainly with Breonna Taylor, that wasn't a federal warrant, that was a state warrant. And so they're being very disingenuous with the family and with the community about what this bill will actually do, absent accountability.
Jason, let me get your thoughts on this, because as Cheryl mentions, the GOP is adamantly opposed to any kind of meaningful, significant change in any kind of legislation, especially when we talk about the qualified immunity issue.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad that we have Cheryl on the panel. She is representative of, I would say, a good portion of police executives across the country who actually want these kinds of changes, actually want accountability, because it builds trust with the community. It allows for them to do their jobs better. It allows for them to have the cooperation of the communities that they police, because they actually have the trust that they will be held accountable if they do something wrong. So there are lots of police executives who are like Cheryl, who actually want this kind of thing. And I agree 100% with what she stated. You know, if you look at the city of Chicago, for example, who historically has had incredible amounts of issues with its police department, and particularly against Black communities, Black and brown communities, as we saw with Adam Toledo recently being killed by a police officer when he dropped the weapon and had his hands up. You see that in 2018, the city spent $113 million settling police brutality cases.
It's really staggering when you throw those numbers out.
Yeah, it's crazy. 85% of that was to settle the cases. The other, percentage, 15%, was for legal fees. So that should not come out of taxpayers' pockets. That should come out of the people's pockets who are responsible. And I don't know if Cheryl will agree with me here, but I believe it should come out of police pensions, because that way other police officers will hold their colleagues accountable and make sure that they don't do anything, because they are all going to be affected by it. But it shouldn't come out of the pockets of taxpayers. This is a way, and we need to end qualified immunity. People who commit crimes should be held accountable for what they do. Violating someone's civil rights is a crime, and that person should be held accountable.
Cheryl, your thoughts? Should it come out of those pensions?
No, I can't agree with that on any level. No, it should not, but it certainly should come out of the offender's wallet. And so I think individual officers that commit these kinds of atrocities should be held accountable. Now, what Tim Scott is talking about is charging the department with that financial burden. But what have you taught the officer? What has that officer learned? We know if you don't teach them a lesson The next officer will go on to collect 18 personnel complaints as though they were gifts from a good friend, much like Derek Chauvin. Garrett Goff had over a dozen complaints. He's the officer that shot Rayshard Brooks in the back. And so officers need to know it has to affect their bottom line. And I'm a street officer. I'm a ground pounder. And I know if you don't do anything that affects me day to day, when I get in that black and white, I don't care what else you do or talk about.
Okay. Imani, I'd like to bring you into this conversation. We talked earlier about there was such a groundswell of support when just how heinous this whole incident was. And you think back that really most of the American public was kind of watching on pins and needles when the jury verdict was going to come out. Now, in hindsight, of course, we can all look at it and say, if this isn't a case for manslaughter, what is, or murder? I want to ask you, do you think that Floyd's murder appeared to be a turning point for the United States, or is this something that built up steam, built up frustration? There was that constant presence in the street, and now people have moved on to something else.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's really important to acknowledge that, in particular, white allyship has always been there, right? But has also always been waning. So we could literally go back to abolitionists, demanding an end to slavery in 1800s, to white freedom riders who were beaten and jailed, marching with, Dr. King in the 1960s, and all the way till, as we saw, the support reach an all-time high of white allyship in 2020, and say that it's been there. I don't know if it's necessarily a matter of something else has taken precedence, but the reality is that it hasn't sustained. And the ability to, have a small percentage who have always supported the liberation of Black people, who have supported the anti-police state violence that we've seen since, Black people set foot in Jamestown, Virginia in 1619. The reality is I don't see it changing. So yes, all the reports came out earlier this week that allyship is drastically down as it was a year ago. I don't think, our colleagues mentioned, right? We saw, as a result of the pandemic, there was a lot of support for Black Lives Matter. There was a lot of support and outrage after the murder of George Floyd. But, nothing has sustained, and percentages have gone drastically lower.
Joseph, from George Floyd's family, President Joe Biden got high marks for inviting the family in, talking, listening. But let's talk about the fact that really nothing of significance, other than more demonstrations, has happened. Is it fair to say that Joe Biden is doing a good job at this point, or would you like to see more coming from that administration?
Well, he's doing a good job compared to what? And compared to who? Donald Trump? I mean, compared to Donald Trump, he's doing fantastic. He's doing a fabulous job. Compared to LBJ, not so much. I mean, and I think that is an example of where we are right now. We've had it's been this constant in the United States where when it's coming to rights for African Americans, it is 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and sometimes 1 step forward, 2 steps back. It's always been in flux. It's never been sustained. You can look no further than the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which for some reason had a sunset clause in it. The same thing for the Missouri Compromise and for Reconstruction and a bunch of other initiatives that were initially aimed at promoting and advancing the African American agenda and Black people in the United States. But for whatever reason, the political winds shift, they change, the ground rumbles under the feet, and the next thing you know, we're back where we were before, or if not exactly back where we were before, we were not anywhere closer to where we need to be. So it's not surprising to me that white allyship has fallen off. I mean, during the protests of last summer, overall, 67% of all Americans, that's all Americans, 67% supported Black Lives Matter. By September, it was down to 55%. And back in the heyday, it was 6 in 10 white people and 47% of Republicans thought that this was the right thing to do. But as things change and as we get Derek Chauvin's conviction, people have a tendency to kind of dust their hands and feel like the problem has been solved, when really this is just one aspect of a problem. And during the Chauvin trial, 3 more unarmed African Americans died at the hands of law enforcement. There was nowhere near the outrage, nowhere near the frustration, nowhere near the protests. So it is endemic in America that we get some advancement, we get some momentum, and then it stalls out if other things take priority. It's a historic cycle, in my opinion.
Okay, and let's also, I want to show you all a map map of basically mapping police violence since the attack. Something like 181 blacks have been killed by police since the George Floyd death. Jason, we just heard those numbers that Joseph talked about. What is it going to take for this to resonate with people of the United States? At the very top, you know, you heard a member of George Floyd's family saying, if we can protect a bird, why can't we protect people? And some of the best known celebrities in the world appearing on TV in tears, walking around saying, I feel like I have a target on my back.
You know, I wish that I could say that I am optimistic about the future in terms of what we can do. I do believe that, you know, in the American spirit and that we can actually solve a lot of problems, excuse me. But at the same time, we've seen this isn't with George Floyd. It wasn't the first time that we heard a man say he couldn't breathe. It wasn't the first time we saw a man struggle or a woman die unnecessarily. And I'm old enough to remember, you know, 1992. We had this on video. The only thing that's gotten better, as cliche as it sounds, is the quality of the video. And we've seen these kinds of things happen over and over. People maybe have some empathy for a second, and then it subsides, and then you get right-wing talking points that blame the victim. So this idea that, you know, we can possibly get to a better place, I'm holding out hope. But I can't say that there's some sort of evidence based on what we've seen historically with police brutality that this is somehow we're at some sort of turning point. I don't, you know, lots of people thought last summer was a turning point, and as just about everybody on this panel has stated, we are still pretty much in the same place that we were. And, you know, we had little girls die, Ayanna Stanley Jones, you know, 7 years old. We had little boys die, Tamir Rice, 13 years old. We've had women die, you know, Rakia Boyd in Chicago. We had, you know, we've had men die. We've had men say that they could not breathe and ask for some bit of mercy. We had men walking and running away and get shot in the back. We've had people with cell phones. And none of it has necessarily had a sustained impact, not only on policy, but on the amount of empathy that comes from other communities. So, you know, I want to be optimistic and say that we can change things, but I can't say that it's based on any kind of evidence.
Cheryl, I want to call on your expertise once again and your experience working the streets, and now that body cameras are such a part of an officer's uniform. Thinking back on 2014, when Michael Brown, unarmed, was shot and killed by a white police officer in Ferguson, Missouri, and that officer was never charged. How has the pressure to get more police entities to use these body cameras, how has that changed? And one thing I can think of just off the top of my head is, if you look at the transcript, George Floyd more than 20 times said that he could not breathe, and that was because of the audio that was picked up in large part on those body cameras.
I don't know that it's really had much of an impact. There are certain departments that are still not equipped with body cam. But listen, for me, it matters not, because police officers get tunnel vision. And when they're in the throes of an apprehension or at the end of a foot pursuit, they've lost total consciousness about the fact that they're being recorded, and they do that thing that they do regularly. And so the problem is it's twofold and it's multifaceted. But listen, understand that the fish rots from the head. We're talking about the heads of these police departments, administrators, police chiefs. We saw just very recently in the case of Ronald Green in Louisiana that the trooper, the lieutenant colonel, whatever his rank is over there, Lamar Davis, a black man, sat on that video for 2 years. He knew that that video existed, and I imagine he was probably trying to craft a story that would sit well with the public because he knew eventually it would be made public. And we've seen time and time again, there's a command staff officer in Williams County, Texas, a sheriff, who gives out gift cards to his officers who beat folks up. We have here in Los Angeles on the county sheriff's department 17 internal gangs, deputies who go out and get tattoos, the executioners, the regulators, the Vikings. They go out and they get tattoos and have celebratory barbecues when they beat and kill folks. And it's not like Sheriff Alex Villanueva on the LA County Sheriff's Department doesn't know that this goes on. And so it's cultural, it's systemic, it's top down. And so folks need to get real about what's going on. The FBI told us KKK have infiltrated. There are folks who join for the sole purpose of engaging in violence against certain ethnic groups and racial groups. We know that.
Imani,
we need to address it.
Imani, also one of the most effective tools that has really cropped up is the cell phone. And I certainly don't believe that officers started abusing suspects about the same time the iPhone became popular. Clearly, this has been going on for some time, but it certainly changed the life of Darnella Frazier. She was the young girl, the 17-year-old, who videotaped the incident with George Floyd. And it also was a way to knock down the police narrative that Floyd was having a medical incident during police interaction. How important, obviously, is it that everyday people now have these quality phones and can take pictures of this, can video of this, and get that out there as quickly as possible?
It's incredibly critical, but as my colleagues literally just mentioned, Rodney King's beating was video recorded, and that was in 1992. So Miss Frazier, a teenage girl who had the wherewithal to not only press record, but to keep recording in the midst of watching a murder. And no one, especially a child, especially a teenager, should ever be responsible for maintaining that level of poise in the midst of such injustice. So it is critical that we have cell phone footage, but we also saw with everyone, and the list goes on, unfortunately, of individuals unarmed who have been murdered at the hands of police, and we've seen it. So I think it's important that we have access to these modern day lynchings as a sense of holding the public and the private, like, consciousness. It's a matter of consciousness, because we've seen in many cases where we've had the footage and the grand juries and people will still not be held accountable for their actions. Fortunately, yes, in the case of George Floyd, we saw that Derek Chauvin was held accountable for that murder, but I don't necessarily think that's the game changer right now. It's not the cell phone footage. It's not the capturing these lynchings on film and recording them and sharing them in a digital fashion. We need to move past the fact that, like, this sort of tragic issue that we have in the United States, this does not happen in any other country in the world. And that, I think, going back to the root issue is the only way that we're going to really have any sort of systemic change. It's because we can continue to record these, share these, have them streamed on Facebook Live, as we've seen before, and nothing has happened. Nothing's changed.
Joseph, I can talk about this issue till the end of time, but it's not something that I can relate to. I can't go out on the street and experience what I'm sure you have experienced perhaps your entire life. I can tell you, one time I went out to Los Angeles and an African-American friend of mine said, "Why don't you drive? I don't want to be guilty of DWB." And I just like, I don't understand what that means. And then he explained it to me. But just kind of talk about that this is real, this is going on, and it's not just people who are trying to sell individual cigarettes or trying to pass a phony money. It happens all the time.
Well, and you put your finger on something important there. I mean, because every black man I know, I've been stopped by the police 3 times, I had a gun pulled on me once, and every single time, there has been no accountability. Every black man I know has a story. Many black women I know have stories. My father got beaten up by the Philadelphia police and held in jail overnight in 1951. And that just shows you how systemic this is. And the thing that you put your finger on, I think, is that we can talk about body cams all day. You know, we can talk about integrating police all day, because the police chief in Rochester, Daniel Prude, when he died, that police officer was part of a conspiracy with a black mayor to try to sit on the videotape, because police unions are so very powerful. And so if you look back at the origins of police departments, they were they came out of the slave patrols. They came out of an attempt to kind of control African Americans one way or the other, and it's still going on. But I think the bigger picture here is the fact that we have not effectively dealt with race in America, period. Because all of these things that we're talking about stem from the fact that we still have not reckoned as a country with our original sin. We still have not had open talks about slavery at the highest congressional level. We still have a one party that is thrown in with a white supremacist. I mean, and that I don't say that lightly, but the record proves that I'm correct on that.
Right.
And until we do, we're not going to have any kind of meaningful reform. We're going to nip around at the edges. The fact that police are there, I think 1,800 police departments in the United States, there's no one uniform law regulating them all. So until we get down to the nitty gritty and talk about the fact that we have a race problem in America, I don't see this problem being effectively solved. We'll nibble around the edges, but we'll never get to the heart of it.
And Monty, I think you want to jump in?
Yeah, because that's exactly, thank you so much, Joseph, for being a little more eloquent than I was, because it's so real. Yes, until we deal with the original sin, which is slavery and the enslavement of African people in this country, we will not have any sort of sustained evolution. And that's really what I'm hoping for. I have a 7-year-old son, and I hope and pray for an evolution in race relations in this country. But we can't even have conversations. The 1619 Project, right? A phenomenal piece of journalistic work that Nicole Hannah-Jones produced is currently now being attacked by conservatives and banned in various school districts because people don't want to address the truth.
Monty, I also want you to follow up. I'm sorry, we don't have a whole lot of time left, but you mentioned you have a 7-year-old son. Have you had the talk with him yet?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Unfortunately, I had to have it well before he was 7. And the reality, he is very aware of the way in which people who look like him, Black people in America, are treated. And it was one of those things. I didn't have the privilege that my non-Black friends have of shielding their children from the harsh realities of living and operating in this country.
Unbelievable. Cheryl, I want to give you the last word just real quickly. We're very short on time, but your thoughts on the best way to move forward and address some of these issues that we just heard our panelists talk about.
Accountability, accountability, accountability. And if we can't get qualified immunity, we have a senator here in California who's pursuing legislation that would decertify officers. Certainly any police chief, if you have a Derek Chauvin or a Garrett Rolfe on your roster, you can, if you can't get them off the department, you can very easily take them out of the field. Working patrol is not a right.
Okay.
And so get them out of the field and then get them decertified and off the ranks.
Strong word, Cheryl. An excellent way to end this discussion. I want to thank all of our panelists for this very frank give and take over the last half hour. And again, thank you all for watching The Heat as well. Everybody have a safe evening.